Final presentation of the day by Jomy Joseph, who is our lovely new colleague in the Anthropogenic Soils project, started as a postdoctoral researcher this fall. Jomy is an industrial designer, and his research interests include speculative futures, long-term sustainability, technological disobedience, regenerative ecology, politics, and culture. And Jomy is part of the Anthropogenic Soils project, which is called Soil Futures. So that's a nice way of rounding off today. So he is sharing today, I think, mainly about his PhD work, which was defended in March this year, and had the title ReFuturing Studies, Rehumanizing Futures Through by Design at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. So Jomy's research explores a systematic generative research by or through design inquiries, exploring alternative, emergent, and concrete utopias articulated through speculative industrial design. So he does this by making and fabricating artifacts and design fictions and exhibitions and research explorations. In Jomy's postdoc, he is exploring the systems and structures and materialities that currently enable a designed culture to defuture and dehumanize human-soil relations for a privileged few that further entrench the unsustainability of everyday life for the many, humans and non-humans. And Jomy wants to explore how industrial design in an interdisciplinary framework can refuture and rehumanize alternative soil futures by reclaiming the present such that the future is completely different when it arrives. Jomy, welcome.
Thank you so much, Nora. So I have the pleasure to do the last presentation of the day, so I'll try to keep your energies high. I know I'm competing with dinner and coffee, so I'll try to do that. Thanks to the generous introduction by Nora, I'm just going to give you a brief outlook of where I come from, my position. Like, I am from industrial design, which is not usually a discipline that is in these spaces, for the reason that it is usually busy designing things, seductive futures for technological, optimistic, utopian futures of industrial capitalism. So it's a new role that I want industrial design to take. So my postdoctorate is also going to explore these issues. But my focus, and I'm going to talk about my PhD because this was where I'm coming from. I was asking, how can industrial design enable imagining radically hopeful futures in the context of long-term sustainability? Now, all of these words mean things, but the fundamental point of this research question is to generate ideas. It's an inquiry that generates ideas. And I do this through design. And the through and the slash by is a technological or technical term that's been debated a lot, whether it's research through design, whether it's research by design. A lot of these things are contested in the design research space, so I'll spare you the complications of that. It's more about generative research, so the design activity comes first, and what I'm going to present is the outcomes of those activities and what knowledges that they bring about. So it's going to be a bit of a presenting the problem first and the solution, but also the solution first and the problem. So how do you imagine solution spaces by design? Speculative design, fundamentally put, is the practice of trying to imagine a future that could be based on the future that is and the world that we live in. But it's also not just imagining an idea and projecting into the future. It's about understanding the complexities and the structures that we live in, the actions, the knowledges, and all of these things that are enabling us to recreate and regenerate the world that we live in, and regenerate and recreate a world that we could want to live in, or we could have, and two different paradigms. And I think if you have the choice to imagine any future, why would you choose dystopian futures? Wouldn't you imagine more hopeful, radically interesting futures? So that's my take on concrete utopianism. We can come to that. How do I do this? Okay, what if you could bridge these worlds, the world that is, which is unsustainable, as we know from all the climate reports, and what if we could imagine, in a science fiction terminology, a wormhole into this future, that it was possible. And in that case, you are engaging with this kind of dialectic. You're engaging in this kind of traveling between worlds. And it's a fun movement. And how do I do it? How do I, as a designer, do this? I do it through making worlds through things. Design objects, artifacts from a future that doesn't exist in order to understand the world that is, but also imagine solutions. Probably, what if things could change? So, and this is a world-building exercise that goes on many levels. And diegetic prototyping, which is a fancy way of saying building prototypes for a world that is in the fictional narrative. Could even do narrative experiments, diegetic experiments, speculating on science. What if another science was possible? And if it was possible, what would the world become if that was possible? And the final outcomes are in the research terminology called research products. They used to be called diegetic prototypes, but they've advanced enough to say, okay, these are specific products that we make. These are mock-ups. They're not like functional prototypes, so there's a difference. To just be able to understand the materialities and the complexities of what it would take to make these objects. I'm going to discuss these artifacts later. So I'm just going to give you an example from my PhD about, okay, if you're going to build this wormhole, you need to understand the world that you're traveling from, okay? And I want to talk about the world that is. Let's start from here. And I think in my case, it was a discussion around what kind of world we want when it comes to this issue, which is we're stuck with all the IPCC reports talking about how we've emitted more carbon in the past 30, 40 years, ever since we've known about the crisis, all the IPCC, since the first IPCC reports. And it's also undeniable that this is human-caused. And the thing is that everything in this room, everything we touch, feel, put our foundations on, the food we eat, the communication systems that I'm embodying right now, is all based on a certain logic of the world. And it's built, the built environment is expensive. It took a long time, and it took a lot of investment to make this. But it's also now, living on a planet that doesn't exist anymore. The logic of the planet has changed. There is another question of the definition of civilization. If we call this civilized life, we are also heading into a planetary shift, which is going to force us to do different things. And what does that mean? So if if it's just from a metric of, if we're going to clamp down emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, we should have done it earlier, but since we haven't, and if we still have the goal of 1.5, which is looking very unlikely, we still have this massive drawdown. That means that all this high emissions lifestyle that we're leading needs to change. And these choices have huge impacts. And regardless of whether we act or not, this sort of seemingly proverbial cliff is coming. It's probably already here, but the UN just declared that climate breakdown is upon us. It's here. It's not something in the future. What does that mean? Okay, and what are we facing in these situations? Is first of all the question: why haven't we changed? We've known this for so long. Why haven't we changed? So we have to explore, and I did explore this in my research. Was okay. There are obvious institutional factors in place. And one of the biggest factors is fossil fuel denial. It wasn't just fossil fuel companies, it was fossil fuel institutions and nation states, which funded and celebrated fossil fuels as the only way to reach a better future. And this was the basis of the legitimacy that we've had. So we've known, and by we, I mean the fossil fuel companies, knew, and they were one of the first pioneers in climate science. They were the ones who did the early science. And what did they do? Knowledge became action. What kind of action? Denial. This was true of things back then. This is true of things right now. And we're living with the legacy of those decisions. I guess it's also a question I don't have to. It's probably obvious in this room. Everybody knows this. The responsibility of emissions is also part of this, discussion. Who is responsible for emissions? My emissions in Norway are much higher than I would have had in India, where I come from, living the same kind of life. That's because we also have a situation where the inequality of emissions, not all carbon is created equal. When we reduce carbon to its fundamental basics, we reduce the responsibility. And when it comes to that, the responsibility of the richest 10% is 50%. And in design, in the design world, when we talk about behavioral change, designing sustainable behaviors and designs for people, we almost always talk about the bottom 50%. Whereas professional designers almost always happen to create tastes and desires for a certain category of people who happen to be at the very top. This inequality is not addressed, actually. This is fundamental. I mean, it's being addressed now in the education system, but in action, it's completely different. And just by logic, if you wanted to reduce emissions, you reduce the higher percentage, the 50%, not the 10% emissions of the bottom 50%. So we have this issue. Then we have the question of, which is a serious political question, of whose lands are going to be used up. And this is the question of who relates to the land in what way. We also, this is discussing with, the topic of settler colonialism that we are seeing with the genocide in Gaza right now, about the idea that a nature is supposed to be without humans is also a fundamentally colonialist idea. It is also an idea of looking at people as less than human, as artifacts of a nature that's othered, so you have to create other humans. But it's also, the idea of conservation as being, just a sanitized view of nature without people. And this happens to be a logic of displacement and dispossession that happens to talk about, let's just get rid of indigenous people from their lands, who happen to be one of the most vulnerable to climate change, but also one of the few groups of people who actually know how to take care of the land, who actually have a relationship to the land, an intimate relationship to the land. And if you dig deep, you find it's almost always for resources. For a bauxite mine in India, which provides aluminium to the computers that we have. I mean, these are relations that do have an impact. You could have designers designing things without aluminium or recycled aluminium, for example, and this would be different. But it doesn't really address the systemic issues. So my focus has been on understanding these systemic issues too. And this brings me to the question of whose futures are we talking about? And this is Dr. Marx Libron, who talks about colonialism being first and foremost about the land, right? What do you do with the land? Whose futures are embedded in the land? What does the land become? What it could be? Are all factors when it comes to this. It could be for good reasons too. It's still colonialism if it's about displacement and dispossession, even if you preserve it. And this is a good question about what kind of reasons are put forward, and to understand like colonialism. It's a bit of a, and this is again in design discourses, but probably true in many other disciplines, is this kind of nostalgia about colonialism, as though it was a historical oddity. It never really was something that people had to live through, but now we are living in a progressive society. I mean, these past few, I guess weeks have proven that we are not living in a post-colonial world. We're still living in a logic of colonialism. And the question becomes, what are the justifications for that colonialism? This is kind of an interesting conception, the idea that civilization began with agriculture, moved on. Large cities, developed, war, bureaucracy, and all of these things, and now we're in a technological age. We don't have the issues that we had of non-agricultural societies. And because of this linear progression, we can sort of say that, okay, societies that did not choose to develop industrial technologies are backward. And this was actually a justification for colonization that European philosophers were making, because we need to find a reason, right? I mean, you have to dehumanize the people you're going to colonize and say they were less deserving of the lands they live on because they don't produce the food. Happens to be that they just leave the land fallow. That's a choice to be made. And this is also how the idea of technological civilization. Like there's a linear progression to the past and the future. The idea that it's utopian to think high-tech, but that's the price you pay. I mean, if a society is more high-tech but less in touch with the land, has forgotten its relations. That's okay because it's justified because people are of the future. So high tech, you kind of create this distinction. Progress and growth means this. If you don't do that, if you are stagnating or you relapse, then it's collapse. That's the collapse. So if you think about science fiction futures, wherever there's climate dystopias, there are some of the elements of this low-tech, society is falling apart, there's these idea of a nature which is violent and regressive, and then a tamed nature for the civilized folks. And then you have to dominate nature or be subjected to its whims and fancies. People become either noble savages or, they're either noble or savages. Nobles because they have to be saved, savages because they don't want to be saved. And the idea of developed and developing countries is also kind of tied to this, which is why it's an oddity to think about the global south in these things. But these are arbitrary. These are constructions. They can be different. And the idea of civilization is a big question, yeah. And this boils down to how design and designing has been influencing these visions and actually embedded that in everyday life. The idea of techno-utopias in the everyday. And I speak as an industrial designer here that I see artifacts in this room that were designed to create a certain conception of progress, and this is not by accident. There are professionals doing this work. Social media, the same thing. All of these things are part of a systemic nature of design and designing. Sometimes intentionally done and almost always justified as the right thing to do. Even though its systemic impacts are obvious. We live in a time where these desirable futures of the past, plastics was hailed as this remarkable miracle artifact. We all have microplastics in our blood. We didn't make that choice. Our ancestors, previous generation, did make that choice. And it was presented as the obvious thing to do. Planned obsolescence is the same thing. It also undermines the technology. I think this is also, I actually love technology. I think it's a great tool for finding solutions, fixing things, and things need to be fixed. But it's also an undermining of what technology is for and what it's done for. There's an illusion, or I think it's an illusion about projecting onto technology these supernatural qualities. But it's also, at the same time, has a deeply skeptical view of humanity. It's supposed to be like, people have to be fixed through technology. So, if there's a democratic dissent, you have to surveil them because it's for their own good. If there is technology that is being resisted, the Luddites, they don't know technology, or they're anti-technology. But the promise of technology about being transcendent has, at the same time, led us to being alienated more and more. At the same time, and this kind of expectation, so this construction of a past and a future that's utopian and dystopian if it's not high-tech, also creates this expectation that we need to have constant scientific development. All these problems that we are causing will be all solved away if we just had more research, more technological research. Okay, what we're finding in the past, let's say 50, 70 years is disruptive science has been declining. And one part of this is the professionalization of research, is that a lot more scientists and researchers and academic community is spending more time trying to write grants than to actually do research. That's one reason. There are many other reasons too. And this is true across the board, apparently, which was a shocking thing. It just came out in 2023. And this is the question of many of these things, and I think this book, The Dawn of Everything, really talks about this. One of the things that they talk about is these ideas of what are the fundamental freedoms? Like, why does it feel like we cannot really imagine a better future? When in fact, they talk about our ancestors, early human civilization was freely able to imagine futures. And they based it on three fundamental social freedom was the freedom to move away, which was just relocate. And because you could relocate, you would be treated as family. The hospitality of people receiving you was greater. And this is something that we see stark contrast of with climate refugees, totally disregarded as human. The freedom to ignore or disobey, democratic dissent. We cannot seem to imagine even the slightest critique of the system, without worrying about our jobs. And this is another thing that's been proven in the past couple of weeks. The freedom to shape entirely new reality. And this is, for me, the third freedom is kind of interesting, fundamentally as a designer, is the ability to imagine futures that we might think unthinkable. And this is something we're trained for, or we are trained to imagine other futures. And not just imagine them, but to shift between them, to be able to imagine them and make them real. So imagine this room is one future. And I told you there's another room out there, and you could just go there, and the rules are different. The political, social, economic, technological rules are completely different, and you can imagine yourself in another world. It would be that easy, and this was fascinating to me to understand. What they do say is that this ability, this fundamental ability, as though obvious, was lost. And how they got lost was when they're talking, of course, about the origins of patriarchy, about how acts of violence reserved for one's enemies became embedded within one's own family, intimate relations, and became a justification for care. How do you justify violence when it's intimate, other than saying it's for your own good? It's to care. And this actually boils down to also, you extrapolate that, and you find out, which is something that they talk about, how indigenous communities, when they got in contact with European settler colonists, were surprised at how much of this intimate violence was an embedded everyday part of life. And if you think about how we base our technological developments, our ideas of nature as something to be dominated, technology to be done to this wild nature, this world that's behaving erratically, given climate change and all of this stuff, and the techno-solutionism that comes with it. It's about saving nature. It's about, we need to protect the world from us, and we have to care for it. But the way we care for it is based on a certain logic of domination. And fundamentally, this erosion of the third freedom for me also brings into the question, why is it that we cannot imagine another room? Even if we imagine it, it's probably one, but what if I told you there were an infinite number of rooms? That kind of brings me, and this was something for me revealing in my own research, is that it is really difficult to imagine systems and structures that are completely different from our own. I mean, if you want to imagine a post-capitalist system, you either have an example of a communist system, which was practiced by the Soviets or something. But between them or beyond them, there are very few options. And this kind of idea that this is what fundamentally defuturing means. It's a term by Tony Fry, who coined this term. It's about this very narrow vision of the future. It's about negating, that particular vision of the future negates all possible other futures of humans, non-humans, and their relations. But what it does is also, given that those possibilities are taken away, there's also dehumanizes those humans who negate or steal others' futures. And I think this brings me back to this context of systemic failure. Like, we're going through Earth systems failure, but also the question of, a lot of us will think, okay, the system is failing. A lot of the most well-meaning folks in economics departments will be like, yeah, the system is failing, we need to do something, we need to intervene, change certain things. But systems thinkers will say, the purpose of a system is what it does. If you want to understand a system, you have to study it. You have to understand based on what its outcomes are, not what it claims, not what it's supposed to do, but if you institute a system, understand it for what it does. And based on that, it's clear that it's defuturing and dehumanizing from many levels. Even those who claim a better future for themselves are getting dehumanized because the possibilities could have been endless. So, trying to take a different turn here in my research was, how do you break these frames? What would be a practice of design and designing that would enable this refuturing? So even reinventing what it is to be human, or reinventing what it is to future, beyond this conception of the past and a future. And to rehumanize. And this is something inspired by what Paulo Freire talked about in Pedagogy of the Press. It's kind of archaic in a lot of design community because participatory design was really inspired from that in the 70s. But it's also about reclaiming the alternative present. So forget about the future. It's about changing the now so that the future is completely different. And like I said, what if things were different? You don't have to do much here to imagine different futures. In my work, you can even imagine a screw that's different and it'll change everything. So what if that could be? And so in my work, I work with speculative design, so the what could be, the other world that could be. And in my practice, I sort of thought about what if instead we could care for a civilization that actually cares, that redefines civilization, so-called civilization, to mean other things than what it does. And thinking about land, this was sort of for me an important thing. Like right now, we need to think a different relation to the land, and land beyond, beyond sometimes people themselves. No more sacrificial lands, no more sacrificial people. So this is a fictional journal from the future, which I created. It was an academic, sort of pseudo-academic exercise, a fictional exercise to create a journal. It's been translated now into 4 more languages apart from English. It's about the first century of climate reparation. So it's from the year 2131. These are future academics, design researchers writing about the past, what was known about climate change, what was unknown, and what their ancestors, which is us, did to do this. And of course, being a designer, I'm talking about solutions. What kind of solutions were implemented and what changed over a course of the history. And what kind of institutions became, institutions of caring. So the first chapter looks into energy. So these are 3 themes that are being discussed. Energy, so fossil abolition, clear as day, looking into renewable energy ecosystems that take over, transition, and what happens to social cultures that revolve around high energy use that we do now, and when it changes, like what would it become? The second chapter was actually directly dealing with soil and land, and when I say terrestrial ecosystems, thinking about changing those relations with land. Land beyond soil, land beyond the reductive notions of whatever human beings can get from it. The third chapter, which looks into water, so all these issues about permafrost melting, polar ice caps, marine ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems. And I do this through imagining what are these technologies of care? What if technologies could be applied to care? Do you need to reinvent new ones? Maybe not. I think we can reinvent the applications of what we use right now. In terms of land, there are these, in the story, there are these guerrilla agroforesters who decide to plant old growth forests because they can. There are social policies that are implemented, of course, many things that are implemented, but just going to talk about the design interventions. These are artifacts that I designed for this world. What happens when these agroforesters apply these methods? They invent these places called climate resilience zones, which is a retaking of the urban landscape from capitalist production and rewilding terrestrial ecosystems for biodiversity. What happens when you automate these systems? So over time, this inspires a new movement in 2072 to use autonomous seeders to do this. Technologically, all of these things are possible. But what this talks about is what happens when these are festivals. These are social festivals, gatherings of people who do this for fun, along with citizen science groups. What happens to material fabrication cultures that happen? So this is something called symbiotic fabrication pods, a fancy word for saying instead of factories that use industrial production, these are symbiotic fabrication spaces that work with the forests, these old growth forests, that only survive in this symbiotic relationships. That means you need to have less consumption, but more radically interesting ways of being. Industrial design sort of supports that. Another thing about energy, so this is another artifact in terms of energy systems, like how do you fabricate, on-site? And so it's sort of taking 3D printing to another level and discuss what if you could have a lot of these open science, open tech, citizen science communities that can reclaim, provide alternatives that are actually implementable now, beyond the industrial aspects of it. I'm just going to rush through a bit of this, many artifacts. So what if you could 3D print solar structures right here, right now? What would happen to these energy cultures? So what would happen to these fictional, and sort of imagine these fictionalized indigenous communities that sort of have this interesting relationship with energy. They are still high-tech, but they apply energy in a very different way than we would. And they learn about their landscape with this. And biomineralizers. So what would happen if you need to regenerate heavy metal tech that we use, computers and all of the high-tech stuff we use? We don't have to reject high-tech. We can still make them and remake them in different ways. What would happen if we needed to access all these atmospheric rivers that we put in the air and generate artificial glaciers? What if we could create coral seawalls out of carbon negative materials, but also create marine rewilding programs, which are similar to the climate resilient zones on land? All of this is just to talk about a provocation. Like, I think the idea that we could indigenize everyday life. And now this is a very provocative term, and I also understand the contestation of the word itself, indigenization, but it's basically a fundamental return to reestablishing our systems that try to redo or rethink how we relate to the land. So our systems, our social institutions, political structures, our technology should be more off the land, which we belong to, than acting as if we are alien from it. And this is a fundamental term that I sort of got inspired from Grace Dillon, the indigenous scholar's work about a return to ourselves. And I think it's a very beautiful way to say it. It also encapsulates both dehumanization and rehumanization in a very nice nutshell. It's more like we've forgotten a way to be indigenous to the land, to have relations that matter beyond the spectacle of futures. And this is my sort of work, but you would say, okay, great, you can do all this speculative work and everything, but I'd say, okay, yes, but also we need to come back. All this fictional work the point is to come back and change the now. And that's the point of refuturing, is to forget about this dichotomy in the past and the future. It's about now. And you come back so that you can make other voyages. Given this new information, given this study, what else can we do? Well, it turns out we have many alternatives now. If we rearrange the complexity of this room, we would get a different future, completely different. You just have to change your seating. But if that's possible, then it's also possible that a room full of smart, engaged researchers, citizen scientists, scholars can actually come together to change the world. And this is how change happens. This is what transformative change means. And it's also obviously true that there are many alternatives. The idea that there is no alternative, which is artificial construction, is only true if everybody believes in it. So, what if X? What if Y? And there's many what ifs that you can ask. And that's the whole point of refuturing studies. Why the term studies? Like, why is it? It's more research is required, It's also about an ecology of disciplines. Me being an industrial designer can only do so much. I cannot just imagine. At a certain point, imagination can only do so much, right? But fundamentally, the question is, and this is sort of how hope for me looks like, is that do you imagine futures where there is dancing? Not just for yourself and your own disciplines, but for others. And what kind of dancing would you like? Not everybody gets to dance, I suppose. Maybe the fossil fuel companies don't get to dance. They have, they've done enough. But it's also a story that's constantly being written. And for me, dancing is also an invitation. It can only be done. It's always better when you have other people who dance with you. So, and that for me is the question. And if you're stuck, what if there was dancing? Just assume that was the case, and we do that instead. So on that hopeful, I guess, note, I want to end my talk. Thank you so much for listening. If you have questions, please let me know. I know it's a bit depressing at the end of the day, but
I don't have, here we go. Not necessarily the most depressing. You ended at a quite hopeful note, at least, yeah? So we had planned for Jomy's talk to be earlier in the day, but somehow I find it quite appropriate also that the sort of overarching design perspectives that range to the future as a way of addressing the present and the past and what we consider to be possible is quite appropriate. Yeah. So we have some time for questions and comments for Jomy. Esla?
Thank you, Jomy, for this big narrative also that you're giving us. How could the future be different? I appreciate it, but I'm interested in more concrete ways of how the designing process can look, right? We've heard a lot of projects where it's about bringing communities, people who work the soil, scientists, all kinds of people together, and then maybe have a more participatory process of, how that future. So I just want to know some example. How do you go about to very concretely, how would you then find an alternative future?
I think I would, and given that this work was during the pandemic and I had to do it by myself, but what I hope to do, given this knowledge, is to do differently the things that I'm also looking at different ways of thinking about co-creation. So when I talk about Paulo Freire's work, it was a massive influence to the participatory design. It was massively influential in the design world. There was a lot of participatory action research and bringing together co-design and all of that stuff. But what happened was there was a split. It started to not really do the impacts. Not that it was wrong, but the way that I was taught design was not in that sense, right? So I would start to rethink of where design went wrong. I think it's still an internal reflection for me. The other thing is also strategically look at why hasn't it happened that we've got, for me it's like a fundamental thing. Why haven't we changed? The emissions curve, at least. Just that. Everything is, in terms of, there was this Stockholm Resilience Center paper about the planetary boundaries and how we've crossed almost all of them. Land use change is one of the biggest changes. And it has just continued. And it's for me to understand what happened. What communities were we engaging with? And why didn't it change in the way? So either we don't understand the scale of the challenge, the political crisis of the challenge, it takes a lot of work to make those changes. At the same time, I grew, and one of the reasons why the journal came about was I was reading a lot about how to create change and very few, like you said, concrete actions. And I feel that this is what, at least in design field, happened. There was a lot of talk, but not walking the talk. And there's actually a paper that I wrote with some of my colleagues about, we've talked about sustainable shifts, talked about behavioral changes, talked about how do we reimagine material uses and everything. And I have seen very few examples. So this was for me also an exploration. What I reached the conclusion was it's not knowledge. So even if you can make these journals, it's not the knowledge, it's what people do. And that's where we are politically stuck. Because all of those, some of these things are just policy choices. Right now what's happening with, for example, the Biden administration is just signing off on oil projects. That makes our sustainable work much harder. So some things we are dependent on for policymakers to fix. Other things where we can just talk about, we don't need to consume as much, in this case. And that for me is the alternative. Okay, we can repair, we can do other things. This is for me, I guess, a long way of saying I'm really struggling to find ways of those concrete examples because at least in the design community, it's very hard to say, pinpoint, like, this is the example. And I think it also goes back to the struggle that design is having right now in these discussions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jomy, for this overview and for these ideas about futuring differently. So as you know, in the Anthropogenic Soils project, I'm really interested in bioremediation of soils. And so I was quite fascinated by your example on the biomineralizers, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. Also about like how you imagine and envision to go beyond technofix.
Yes, I think the biomineralizer is quite an interesting one. So there's a lot of this research happening, especially in a context of colonizing Mars. So a lot of these scientific studies are based on NASA's own papers. I just said, okay, what if we do it on the planet here? And then you come up with, there's a lot of tech that's being done. And I found some papers using large-scale fermentation tanks to do this stuff, applying bacterial, fungal, interventions. What I found was the economics of it also drives a lot of these interventions. I mean, if there is intention to actually bioremediate, and that's part of official policy, it might take shape. It might take shape differently, but it would have certain impacts. So I sort of, a lot of my work in trying to look into bioremediation was to really understand, and this is what gave me, or brought me to a point where I had to understand, like, it's not about the soil as the thing, or the material, or the dead inert matter. It's about those relations. And when those relations are better, this becomes much easier. And that's almost unimaginable for us, because the social context this world, or the people in this world live in, is completely different from us. I mean, they don't have the same labor politics as we do, or the same kind of cultural practices. It's a very different practice, which I designed it to be that way, because that's the only way I thought it would be, something else. And about just, for me, the soiling part of it, I feel like the way, this is a starting document to actually just understand, okay, if that was the case, what we do now? So who are the alliances that, that would be relevant? What are the climate scientists would be nice? What are the activities that are happening on the ground? There are a lot of bioremediation activities happening all over the world. And what would it take? What are the other missing links that would really push them in another level and be more transformative? That's still work that I need to figure out. Like, I would love to see that happen. I don't know if it's only design that can do that. I think it is, I don't believe so, but I think supporting that would be nice. Yes.
Thank you so much, Jomy. It's really, really interesting and thought-provoking. I guess I have a question that's related to a couple of concerns. Mm-hmm. One is the way you use the word "we," and I just keep wondering who's included in your "we." Mm-hmm. And then the other way you mentioned social freedoms as a kind of goal, and there were 3 bullet points about social freedoms, and for me they completely echo the colonizing impulse that we have seen repeated again and again in previous centuries. That's exactly the freedom to move wherever you want, to create a new society, and to be, and this has been felt as very, very positive and promising in those different times that they have happened. So then the question is, what's your sort of ethical scaffolding in order to make sure that that this big we is not only repeating old colonialisms?
Yes, I agree. I think the we, so starting point, I think the we is related to this. So I put we as in, there are 2 words for this one. We as in a professional design capacity that I represent, the industrial design field, but also the privileged part of the world, because industrial design in the privileged parts of the world is also part of that futuring practice. So that could also be beyond the discipline of design. Right, that privileging, that we certainly decide a certain kind of future for others, and that matters with what visions we write, what stories we write about, and what kind of knowledges we say are legitimate and illegitimate. And this is true of, like considering now there's a lot of talk about, indigenous knowledges, but, till about some decades ago, it was not even considered, like, or even many years ago, it was not even considered in that gamut of serious academic work. I mean,
well, I beg to differ.
Okay,
Sorry,
yeah.
anthropology is about 100 years old. So
but not in my field. That's why this
not
is
in your not in
yeah. No,
exactly.
Design. No, exactly, because it was considered not. I mean, it was a nice thing to have, and this is where this kind of interdisciplinary discussion is important, because the field that I come from is heavily influenced by other disciplines right? We've only just started to sort of unpack these legacies, these assumptions. And for me, it was important to sort of unpack. And this is also a personal exercise for me. My academic training was not looking into that. The other thing about the fundamental freedoms, I think this is something that the book talks about. So I'm sort of applying that. So they talk about the freedoms to move away. But also when the freedom to move away doesn't necessarily mean that you colonize other people. It's about coexistence, right? It's about your freedom to move away doesn't impede on another person's right to life. So it's about hospitality and mutual reciprocity. That's how I understood those three fundamental freedoms. The ability to also disobey those structures, like the ability to dissent and all these things. So I think that's a good rubric to sort of understand what it means, because right now, the way we design, for example, again, in a design ecosystem, we design these surveillance systems for border control, passport control. So who is within these borders and who is without, and how do you get treated at the periphery? I feel definitely the most inhumane treatment that I feel is at the border. This is me having the privilege to be able to move across the border. But that's where the racialized structures come in. That's where I'm told that you don't belong unless you fill in these criteria, right? And those things are designed. I mean, they're professions that are engaged with this activity, like me. So for me, that was this really opened up ways of those other freedoms that could be possible, where you could actually imagine systems and structures that could do different things if we imagine them differently, but also actually change them. So that was a rubric that I was using. So these are like more trigger points for the speculative exercise to really stretch what is possible. It's not about proving that this is the case, or it's not about proving that this is exactly how history was supposed to be, or all these knowledges. So a lot of these things are just taken for granted in the world-building exercise to sort of create this distinction between these two worlds. So that was in my process. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm an anthropologist or any other discipline.
Yeah. There's a final, I think we'll have to make this the final question or comment from Gabriela.
Yeah, just jumping off the last point about the design process, have you figured out sort of what are the questions that need to be asked throughout the process that maybe checks some of the assumptions of what it is that you're designing, so that we don't start to recreate these systems?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So I think this is where this, moving back and forth, the wormhole thing, conceptually it makes sense, but also in practice it's a whole different story. Like, you can go on one end of the spectrum and say, should I question everything? Like, fundamentally everything. Like, okay, if I assume that technology should be a certain way, then I have to go into the historical context, the social production of technology, and all of who makes this technology, who creates it, all of this stuff. And it can be an endless, rabbit hole, which never ends. Then the question is, you can also be completely free and naive and say, okay, let's assume that this is the case, which often we do. And in any given project, at least, we're always doing these, either moving between the criticality part of it and the naivety of it. How do we do it? I think it's a practice to develop, learn from every project and develop, okay, I've been doing this for a while. Is it really the case that this is going to lead to this better outcome? And most of the time, and this is another thing about design practice, it's so distant from its impacts. Like, the moment you create a desirable future for your client and it goes through, you only see its impacts like, 10 years down the line. So it's hard. Within this particular systemic role, it's really hard to be on point. But I've also seen people crippled by critique or crippled by self-doubt about whether I'm doing the right thing. And I've seen people just leave the whole profession altogether. That's a choice to make, but of course it's not going to be easier either or. So I don't really have a clear answer. I think it was just an embodied practice. Like, I really had to trust myself, my training as a designer, but also be able to say, hey, is my training actually giving me the tools or the mindsets that help me? And it'll be as different for me as it would be for you. And that's just a struggle. I don't think there's going to be a clear answer there. But I hope that kind of gives you something. Okay. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Jomy. I was
so much.
also provoked, and you mentioned that it might be provocative by the concept of indigenization of everyday life. And we've had a couple of representations of particular indigenous cultures today, which there is this conception that indigenous peoples have a particular relationship with the land, right? And in the idea of the indigenization of the everyday, there is an absolute utopia of all of us having that kind of relationship with the land, which I think is a more desirable and more utopian world than many of the technological advancements that you also discussed. So to think about a world in which the concept of indigeneity loses its meaning because we all have such a strong relationship with the land would be my utopia, I think, and one that seems quite far away with the current geopolitical situation. But I think what your talk inspires us to do is not to lose sight of those kinds of alternatives as potential realities, even though they seem impossible to achieve at the present moment. So I think that's really valuable and a good point to stop the sort of new input for the day. So thank you so much, Jomy. And I know that you might have to run straight away, so I will also thank you with a book. So for the Norwegian speakers, we have given them Erik Jonas' book, Fingrene i jorda. And for the English speakers, there's the Anthropocene cookbook. And I suspect you, with your interest in futures, might find that quite interesting, because it's about the futures of food. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.